Welcome back to Vox Terra. Today, I'm reviewing a ProPublica article, Clarence Thomas and the Billionaire. And I'm going to pick it apart and give it a really what I hope you'll find a unique critique, as well as bring in another article from the HuffPost talking about Harlan Crow's Nazi memorabilia collection. Well, that ProPublica article details Harlan Crow, the Texas billionaire Republican mega donor, who is an heir to a real estate fortune, and his relationship to Clarence Thomas, and his sponsoring of Clarence Thomas's vacations or paying for them and flying Thomas on his private jet. There was a vacation in Indonesia, having Clarence Thomas out at his private resort in the Adirondacks. Lavish vacations and the feeling of corruption and non-disclosure. But this article, like many on the topic of good investigative journalists, almost seem to use conservative as a shorthand for bad. I believe that's a problem. You don't hear me disparage conservatives, and for that matter, you don't hear me disparage leftists. My concern is the long-term survival of our species and refocusing politics on that. And there are things within the conservative identity that I would consider good, and there are things in the leftist identity that I would consider good. Why alienate a whole group of people who may agree with a lot of your criticisms? Instead, show how that moneyed influence is harming that long-term survival of our species. So ProPublica, or my nitpick one, is ProPublica defines Harlan Crow as a influential figure in pro-business conservative politics. So one, let's just look at that label pro-business. And the organizations that I'm going to cite for you that Harlan Crow has supported or is involved with, and Clarence Thomas by extension, I wouldn't consider them pro-business. I would say they are supporting what I call the reckless elements of the business community, against competition from more responsible players, more responsible competitors, healthier competitors, be it the renewable energy industry or even organic farming. The article highlighted a video about Clarence Thomas that showed him as a average, everyday man. I believe here ProPublica was sort of trying to show that hypocrite, aspect.
I prefer the RV parks. I prefer the Walmart parking lots to the beaches and things like that.
But you know what? And I think that video was sponsored by Harlan Crow, if I remember correctly. But you know what? Show Clarence Thomas to be a hypocrite or not, if people think he's on their side, it's not going to matter. Because we're all sinners. We all know that. But now I'm going to find for you some evidence that it does matter. The article depicts a painting of Clarence Thomas at that vacation resort in the Adirondacks. Him sitting with other, what they call conservative operatives. One is Leonard Leo, described as Federalist Society leader and architect of the court's turn to the right. Well, rather than just accept that as bad, I went to DSmog, a great journalistic website that exposes the money behind climate change denial and obstruction of environmental causes. Here at their page about the Federalist Society, quote, while claiming a neutral stance, the society has consistently published articles and hosted debates that frame investigations into ExxonMobil and think tanks that question the existence of man-made climate change as attacks on free speech. So you see, they're defending business as usual. They're defending status quo. They're defending ExxonMobil. They're defending the excessive continuous burning of fossil fuels on a heating planet. Por ejemplo, for example, Federalist Society member C. Boyden Gray wrote in Forbes that efforts by the attorneys general to investigate ExxonMobil were a misguided climate change inquisition. And DSmog shows that Federalist Society funding comes from or came from ExxonMobil, the Koch brothers, the Koch Charitable Foundation. The Kochs, if you're not aware, are infamous in environmental circles for sponsoring climate change denial, climate change obstruction. ProPublica quoted Harlan Crow as saying that Marxism was his biggest fear. Now, they didn't elaborate on that, but I'm going to get back to that in a little bit. They pointed out he is a, quote, patron of the Anti-Tax Club for Growth. Well, to some that might sound like a good thing. So let's look at DSmog again. And there they show the Club for Growth was founded by this man, Stephen Moore, who co-authored a book titled Fueling Freedom, Exposing the Mad War on Energy, where, according to the book's review, the authors seem to claim that rather than worrying that carbon energy resources are destroying the planet and looking to renewable energy, We should celebrate the vast contributions that the fossil fuel industry made during the past century. ProPublica points out that Crow is on the board of the American Enterprise Institute, also described as a conservative think tank or organization, and he's been on it for over 25 years. But let's look, what's the problem there? If you think conservative values are good, you value church and family and that kind of in a more traditional sense, well, here's the problem. DSmog cites that the AEI has been funded by fossil fuel interests and has supported obstruction of climate action and environmental regulation. That's what it's really all about, defending those industries. Back to ProPublica, they point out how Harlan Crow made around $10 million in donations to Republicans, and probably more through what they call dark money, meaning undisclosed donations to groups that don't disclose where the money comes from. Well, if you think Republicans are on your side, what's the problem there? I've shown you at Open Secrets the lion's share of fossil fuel donations, political donations, are going to that Republican Party, at least at the federal level. The consequence of that, well, if you look at League of Conservation voters and you rank environmental scorecards, Republicans are typically getting pretty miserable scores and Democrats are getting much better. Now, hey, I'm not saying the Democrats are not also, many of them, in the pockets of their own corporate interests, but at least in this case, they are more influenced by those environmental organizations. And they do respond to us when pressured. The Republicans are not. Thomas's bio on Wikipedia points out that he was an attorney with Monsanto Chemical. Well, Monsanto Chemical was infamous decades ago for this Bhopal chemical plant explosion in India, a deadly, horrific explosion. More recently, I believe they've been bought by Bayer, and now DSmog again shows how Monsanto has been instrumental in funding and spreading disinformation related to the chemical industry, as well as attacks on journalists. And I believe here it was related to the chemical glyphosate, used as, I believe, an herbicide, often unnecessarily, in my opinion, on people's lawns. Well, DSmog pointed out that this expose on Monsanto was ignored by the press, or really underreported. Why would the press ignore these articles, these stories? Well, I believe because the media, for the most part, is either owned by wealthy individuals or large, powerful corporations with ties to other business interests. But then even smaller media outlets that you might think of as independent often are getting funding that's not necessarily disclosed. Why do their YouTube shows look so good? Mine, maybe not so good. So it's easier for these media outlets to just make it look like the sum total of our political outrage should just be channeled into what you might call a culture war, where I think there's some valid disagreements, and either downplay or just sort of back burner these connections to these fossil fuel interests in the so-called liberal media, just kind of underreport them, or in the case of like Fox, maybe ignore them entirely, or even promote their agenda, their think tank's talking points. Well, interesting. Let's just come back to that quote about Marx and so you might have heard that Harlan Crow also has been shown to have, or at least alleged to have, a large, fairly expensive collection of Nazi memorabilia. That was in the HuffPost. So how would that tie in with his quote that Marxism is his biggest fear? Well, if you watch my earlier video on Nazism in Ukraine, which is had been underreported in our media because it doesn't fit with our one-sided narrative on this issue, here I detailed a bit the rise of Nazism in Germany and how it happened as a response to the severe recession in Germany at the time and some of the other maybe unfair treatment they received after losing World War I. And there was this sort of who to blame in the atmosphere in Germany. So you had, and there was pitched battles going on, underreported, between Nazis on the streets and the communists. Well, that's undertold in our history too. That it was the communists who were standing up to the Nazis or battling them. They had two different competing narratives of what's wrong. The communist narrative, well, what's wrong is capitalism and maybe all this money and wealth in the hands of a few people. Now, maybe unfairly calling some of these people parasites, and that's not going to sit well with a lot of the German wealthy individuals, but something's got to change in Germany. Then, or at that time, then you had the Nazi party saying, hey, I'll tell you what's wrong. What they're saying was wrong was this outnumbered group of people, and here is the Jewish people they're targeting. So get everyone to focus their anger on them, and then focus their anger on foreign adversaries. And well, rather than just stopping there and saying, hey, look at some of the obvious parallels, or some of the what I think are obvious parallels today, I want to also point out for you that one of the reasons why the author of Rise and Fall of the Third Reich seemed to think the communists or the leftists lost in Germany to the Nazis, and at least this is how I remember him thinking about it, was that the communists have historically viewed, religion as the opiate of the masses, kind of part of the establishment, part of the oppressors. Whereas the Nazis, now Hitler was opposed to Christianity, a lot of people don't realize that, but whereas the Nazis, they didn't openly antagonize the churches. Instead, if the churches were willing to cooperate with them, they seemed to tolerate or even embrace them somewhat, kind of fitting in with this whole, traditional German or the real German narrative. Well, people like their identities. You rob their identity and you tell them, hey, your traditional stuff is all backwards and silly. It's going to rub them wrong. And let's come back to today now. And if they're not seeing how these reckless elements of the business community are wrapping themselves in a conservative cloak, and they're not seeing that, and they're just seeing this battle as between, a battle between chaos versus order, or tradition versus chaos on the one hand, or liberals viewing it as standing up for people's rights versus oppressors, and you're just antagonizing each other like that, you're not going to get the buy-in we need to get people to refocus on the long-term survival of our species. So I hope you found my analysis of ProPublica's coverage of Clarence Thomas and his connection to this billionaire Harlan Crow, this Republican megadonor Harlan Crow, helpful, enlightening, useful, interesting. And if so, please make sure you subscribe to my channel, you click the notification bell, you comment, you like. Constructive criticism, super welcome. I'll do the best I can do, but remember, it's a low budget, time-consuming affair. And thank you to my 2 patrons at Patreon, Bella Grissi and Environmental Coffee House, for helping keep this show going, and to everybody subscribing and commenting, helping keep the show going, and is helping keep me going with this. And as always, until next time, peace be with you.